I left EA last year. We did amazing things, but I think sometimes just we've gone too far. I love to create. I love to improve things. If you're going to survive that long in this industry, you have to be very passionate about it.
Adolf Kristjansson, the commercial strategist behind AAA EA games.
What was actually happening in terms of Ultimate Team? At some point, there's a break point, and the game's too much about monetization. This has come into the scrutiny of governments. Are we getting into the betting area as kids are fairly young who are playing? You talk about future of gaming, you will have access to the complete gaming library, and you can play it on any device. The last 18 months have been absolutely brutal in the gaming industry.
A collapse for the video game industry.
And you kind of wonder, why is this? I think the main culprit of this is...
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you, Peter.
Good. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. Obviously, we've been talking quite a bit in and around various other bits and pieces that we've done. And there's a lot of the narratives that you've been involved in that led me to want to record this episode with you today. So here we are.
Yeah, sounds good. Looking forward to this.
Good. Let's start with a quick who you are, what you do and why.
Yeah, my name is Adolf Kristjansson. I'm actually originated from Iceland. So one of the many Icelandic Vikings in the gaming industry at the moment. What do I do? I left EA last year after about 13 years, where I had done a number of different things, which I'm sure we will talk about. I have deep passion for the gaming industry in general. I love to create. I love to improve things. And if you're going to survive that long in this industry, you have to be very passionate about it. That is basically the driving fuel behind all the difficulties that you're going to face on the way.
Before we dive into the depths of some of the amazing stuff that you've been involved in, let's hark back to the early days. What got you into games then? How did you start out your career?
So when I was 7, 8, we moved to north of Iceland. It's very cold, very dark. And at that point, the first arcade in town opened up, Pac-Man and a few other titles. My dad was a math teacher in the town, and that's where I used to spend my days. Parents are not really concerned about where we were, what we were doing. It was a world that was a little bit more innocent. But I remember my dad continued to come and pull me out of that arcade because his students were, of course, playing there. But there's something about this new technology that I got actually obsessed about, which continued and has continued throughout my career. I didn't get my own computer for a long time. I had friends who had Sinclair Spectrums, Commodores, Amigas, and I spent a lot of time at that place. And still my father came in and pulled me out of there as well. So they were not a big fan. And at that point, I think parents in general were concerned about impact and the effect of this technology. But I remember I got my first computer when I was, I think, 13 or 14. And there was no way of gaming anything on that. Yellow screen. It was just floppies and it didn't really have anything. You were supposed to learn how to program, etc. But I figured out a way how to put in emulators into that, to take that Hercules graphic card and get the CGI, as they were called at that point, and played then a few of the first games that were coming out on PC. It was fantastic. And after that, I renewed the PCs every single year. And when I had graduated from college, I actually jumped into my first venture with my best friend, which was opening our first retail store, where I built some of the initial connections and relationships in the gaming industry.
It didn't take too long until you entered into quite senior positions, for example, such as Game that came before EA.
Yeah, it's quite funny when you start to reflect on one's career. When I started basically that store, we went to ECCS in UK, if you remember that show. And that's where we were basically chasing the Dreamcast license, distribution license in Iceland. The same thing with Ubisoft games, distributing EA games, etc. So you start to meet people, and I have always been a big believer of building and maintaining those relationships. And I'm still keeping in contact with these people today. It basically kicked off there because we were doing really impressive things. I was asked to come into 2 different companies in Iceland. One which is more just dedicated to gaming. The other one was more of a retail and had gaming involved. And I jumped on the latter opportunity where we actually built that store out from being a very small store into a 9-store chain in a small market as Iceland is about 300,000, which is a lot of fun. Worked with some great people. We had incredible marketing. We were known for having huge lines, not only during openings, but also on weekends, etc., because we were always doing something very innovative, which many took note of. It was then basically when I started to talk to the people at Game about opening up game in Iceland. I met Steve Mason, who was taking care of the international business at that time. And then I didn't hear from him for a long time. Went to the US and took my bachelor's there and my MBA. And then coming out of the university, I said, okay, I'm going to send you letters. And one of them was to game. So they say, why don't you come over and talk to us? There might be something. So I traveled to the UK and managed to make it to a football game as well, but presented to them my plan and my vision for game. Very bold at that time, right out of the university. And they said, we like your profile, but we don't have anything now. 3 months later, I was back in Iceland working on some projects for a big tech company there, where Mark Spence again called me up and said, hey, I might have something for you, but you have to be able to start at this date. We give you a 3-month contract and we'll basically see.
From those early days in game, the industry's changed in respect to that transition from packaged goods to digital. And now what we see today, a lot of ownership of content in respect to subscriptions and community ownership. But looking at the vision that you had for game then, if you were going in again now, what would you do?
It was a really fun time in the industry. I think nobody could really see what was going to happen. What has happened basically in terms of music, in terms of videos, nobody had really talked about streaming. But I don't think we could have done anything differently. In the end, a great gaming store is a place where you want to come and spend your time. It's a place of discovery, to get recommendations, to meet fellow people that are playing similar games, etc. But I was involved in a project at the latter stages in game, where we're basically going to build the game of the future, the store of the future. I think game has done quite well in terms of some aspects of that, where they actually built in the esports part of the stores. What they didn't really develop was how you basically buy content. Most people, the main barrier to digital consumption used to be the part that people didn't want to put in the credit cards. They didn't really want to buy digitally. There was always the belief that people need to have something physical in their hands. And I think that a store, if you think about mobile stores now, why wouldn't you be able to go into these stores and buy all content, whatever you want to do, plus the merchandise, etc. That could have been one version of a future gaming retail store, and add some social part to it as well, because that's what people want. People want to connect, not just play together online. They want to meet in person. So I think there's a lot of opportunities still there, but the retailers just haven't figured that out at this moment in time. But I think there's still opportunities for this.
From the prospect of opportunities to transition into the next big move, you went into EA. So let's talk about that transition from working within game to going to work for Electronic Arts, and also the transition to the global strategy at EA as well.
So basically, when I took over game, it was a change management project. I took over 60 stores. I ended up 100 stores, 2 acquisitions in 2 regions. I built up a hell of a team, promoted a lot internally. So it was really hard to leave that, but I was invited to come to game in UK and be part of the leadership team. At that point, I had some touch points with EA already, which led me into the next move. And when I entered, I took over the international accounts. I aligned the sales teams, because that was the clear move for me from being a retailer myself and then trying to grow the whole thing. I was also asked to take care of a really small business, which was the third-party PC business, which was probably the start of the EA journey. I came in at the same year when EA was starting its origin strategy, building their own platform. So I did that for 2-3 years, and good time, really worked closely with the regional teams, which were fantastic, full of great people at EA. And then I saw what was basically happening in terms of the PS4 and Xbox One. And at that point, the EA's digital business was run by the analytical teams. So if you think about that kind of business, and there was a massive potential there. And it felt a little bit odd that it was being managed by a team. So I proposed to Scott Forrest, who came in at that time to lead the international business, to build out a digital business team within the company. I'm not sure Scott was a big believer in that, to be fair. I got 1 headcount to begin with, and we started to work on these things. We built out a small team of 7 or 8 people initially, which took care of merchandising and everything. That was the international side of it, and we had also a small team in the US led by Ben McCuca. It was such a fun thing to do because you were building a business within a business. And it was also a brand new thing for the platform holders as well. They didn't really know where this was going. They believed in it, but they didn't know exactly what they need to build to get to customers. It was fast and furious, and we formed some amazing partnerships, relationships with the platform holders, and were able to get first advantage for EA into that space. And therefore, we got massive share of voice just because we started early. It wasn't like it is today when it's very transactional relationships. Then it was more about tight collaboration in terms of building those platforms out.
I guess when you first start to build something that is totally new, not just to EA, but at that point to the wider industry, looking back, what were some of the biggest challenges?
Wow, that's a big question. Challenges are obviously headcount. We didn't get headcount because there was more belief in the packaged goods business at that point and trying to balance that with the digital instead of trying to go more aggressively into digital sales. And I think you've seen that with many of the publishers, that has been the case, and it's still the case today. You're always trying to keep the bulk of the revenue, and you're always afraid to move into new spaces and really commit. It's very easy to tell to the street or tell investors or players that this is where you're going, but you have to follow up on that. And I think the industry in general hasn't been great at that. The challenges were obvious. It was a packaged goods company. Share price was at $13. And there was very little movement in terms of the share price at that point. EA definitely needed to grow. It needed to prove to investors that it was a great publisher and players, to be fair, at that point. The challenges, I would say, was a little bit quality in terms of our products. We were really struggling with quality, which was usually solved by throwing marketing money at the problem, as you remember. But the bigger problem is that we were a small team. As I said, we wanted to be a small team. We want to be nimble. But again, you always want to build out a little bit more functions faster so you can serve the company better. But the biggest problem we faced was that it was still a packaged goods minded company. You didn't really get a lot of support from the regions. You're not really seen as somebody who is collaborating with him because you're basically counting the revenue line on a completely different P&L, so to speak. Yeah, it was just really challenging to get people aligned to this new vision. People who actually saw the opportunity, and what was really fun was to work with the platforms and the partners, but it was working with the studios. We did some fantastic works with the FIFA team in Vancouver. We did amazing things with the Battlefield team at DICE, where we created an incredible program with any additional content, an engagement program which actually built out the demand for Battlefield 1, which I think at this point was the height of the franchise. And yeah, what happened is that it shifted much quicker than the company thought. The digital demand grew very quickly. And all these in-game and the live service games start to grow in terms of strength.
That's the point that I was going to bring to you, because the thing is, a lot of people will be listening or watching this and going, what was the days before the likes of Ultimate Team? Like, Ultimate Team's played such a key role in EA's growth. But again, that distinction between packaged goods titles versus this continued experience, it evolves somewhat. So I guess not only touch upon the realities of that transition to some of the games that we see today and how ultimately they were born, but equally from a vision and leadership perspective, who were some of the key people that you were working with and maybe within EA's leadership that saw this transition as a move that needed to be made? Because again, looking at the recent investor event that took place, there's a lot of focus at the moment about generative AI and how AI is going to be brought into gaming within EA. But again, it's just yet another transition that we're going to go through.
It was just really tough to get the regions on that journey, but the studios are much quicker, to your point. They understood the potential. And I think the likes of Matt Bilby was very supportive, Jay McKinley in terms of FIFA Ultimate Team. In terms of the leadership, once Blake and Andrew Wilson saw what was actually happening in terms of Ultimate Team and what potentially could have, they became very interested. And Blake was always on about how can we push this to become even a bigger thing, because he could see what immense impact this was having on the bottom line, both in terms of the digital adoption and in terms of FIFA Ultimate Team. And that was great. It was fantastic. And it actually was giving the players became more engaged. It wasn't all about monetization. It was about engaging the players, keeping them playing the game throughout the football season. So at some point, there's a break point and the games start to become too much about monetization. And I think that it's very important that the industry continues to balance that. I don't think that is necessarily the case at this point in time. I think games are in general over monetized. And as we know, this has come under the scrutiny of governments in different countries. Are we getting into the betting area or not in terms of as kids are fairly young who are playing? I think FIFA or FC today is from 3 years old, I believe. Again, absolutely valid concerns. And this applies to every single platform. All kids today more or less have mobiles. And you can just see the mechanic in games in general are often leading. They're basically being overly monetized, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we did see that transition from what was essentially just a story from the old packaged goods games that we used to play. Once you've completed it, you complete it. But then as games evolved to become more of a live, continued experience, it is that transition between a story to an experience that ultimately keeps you playing. The problem with that is, as you say, the currency now is retention. And if we try to retain people, we have to think about what value we are truly providing the players. It's great to give an immersive experience that continues, creates community, creates better depth of narrative and ultimately better experiences. But again, if we're just focusing on monetization, you fall into the challenges of how close it is to gambling. And also we've seen challenges historically over things like loot boxes. So I am all for change within the industry. I think we really need that desperately. Ultimately, there has to be a fine balance between the pursuit of revenue versus the pursuit of quality, because we owe it to the players to provide the best experience possible. Because games, that harkering back to your experience, it was similar to mine. When I first started playing, it was on Commodore 64. I think I was playing like Wonder Boy or something like that. And they're part of our culture and akin to music. Rather than just using it as metrics to monetize, it's also metrics to connect people and elevate stories. There's huge possibilities there, but yeah, I'm with you in regards to the challenges too.
Yeah, I think there are different ways to actually engage players. There are multiple ways to do that. But if your focus becomes too focused on monetization and your leadership is too focused on that area, and that is where you're going to put the majority of your employees. I feel that quality in the gaming industry is fairly good at the moment. I feel what is lacking is innovation to some extent, but also the fun. I think when we were playing these initial experiences, it was all about the fun. These were fairly simple experiences, but they were fun. They were based on having real fun. Now, it can get forgotten. And you can see some of the iterative games that are coming out every year. There's not a lot of change in those games. And they desperately need change. I do wonder where our industry is going, but it feels that it needs to rediscover the fun, discover the art in games. Some studios are doing that really well. But remember, EA was created by artists in the beginning. So I think we're just going as an industry through a massive transition now. We will come to the realization, I think, that, or I hope, that it's not all about growth and increased revenue year on year. It's also about serving the players in new ways, in innovative ways, and make sure you serve experiences that are first and foremost fun for the players.
Definitely. And we will get to the future of gaming and tech because it's where I want to spend the bulk of the time in this podcast. But in regards to leadership and mentoring and team building, I'd love your take on it and how do you ultimately build high-performing teams, especially in ever-changing and dynamic environments. And also looking at people that really influenced you, because I know during my time at EA, Blake was hugely influential on me. I just thought that the way he thought and approached gaming as a whole, I was really impressed by him. There were others as well, but in your eyes, who inspired you?
Yeah, so I think leadership has changed a lot for the last 20 years. We've seen massive shifts and changes in terms of leadership. We will get to that, but I think in general that leaders can always teach you something. It doesn't matter whether you have a really bad leader or a great leader, they can always teach you something. The leaders that are not up to the task will give you valuable lessons for your future roles. So I think you always have to have that mindset when you're working with people, even if you're not looking after them and they're not motivating you, they can always teach you something. That has been the case for me. From a human perspective, I probably learned the most from Ben McCougan, who sadly passed away very young recently. He was one of the most charismatic guys you would come across. And I'm so grateful that I was able to get many years with him in terms of just understanding how he treated people. And he was extremely warm. He was so fun to be around and is a real miss for the industry that he's not with us anymore. In terms of structure and discipline, I would say that, for example, Olaf Conan, which is a great leader at EA, was extremely good at In terms of asking the right questions, you have Scott Forrest, who is incredible in asking questions and finding the areas which are a little bit more unclear before things move ahead. I could go on. Mike Kearney, great operational person.
Ken Barker was amazing back in the day.
Ken, fantastic. And then Blake was in a league on his own, I would say. But in general, they all teach you something. The second manager I had at EA was German. Fantastic. There was no BS around him. There was no politics. I really admire that. He did extremely well for the international business when he was there in Florian as well. So in general, always learn the good and the bad and apply that to your trade as a leader. In terms of building high-performing teams, you have to start with hiring the right people. It's so sad. I've observed in so many teams where people are hiring in people who will never, ever challenge you. I would say North American approach, hire somebody who basically doesn't really ask the questions because leaders many don't like to be challenged. And then this is probably the best way for them. It can work, but you have to have, in any cases, you have to have extremely good potential, great potential in terms of people, especially in the early days of a business when you have to shift very quickly. You have to fail quickly. But I think as a leader, you just have to walk the talk at all time. You can't be somebody who is just almost like managing the string puppets. You have to be one of the team. You have to be seen doing these things. I think being empathetic is very important, but you're there to listen. You're there to coach. You're there to mentor. You're there to empower people, first and foremost, because the success, in my experience, doesn't come through you. It comes through the team. It comes through the individuals you're working with. And as a young manager, you never understand that because you don't have the personal growth which you need to be able to manage teams extremely well. It takes time. And it's just something that you go through as both as a family person and having managed different teams. You learn all along the way. You learn from your leaders, both good and bad things. And then when you implement that, I would say a great leader, it takes 10, 15 years to mold a great leader. And you have to do that through experience. It's very difficult to teach that in any way.
Definitely. A leader, to me as well, it's not necessarily having to take the forward foot in. They can be at the back. They can be in the middle. The greatest leaders are often positioned where they need to be at that specific point in time. You're there to empower people as well as guide. So, yeah, talking about the guidance aspect, one of the things that you did during EA was you also defined the commercial strategies for franchises like FIFA, Battlefield, Apex, and Star Wars. Looking at that landscape at the time, what was it like? And I guess picking one of those titles now, if you had to define the ongoing strategy, what would that look like as well?
Yeah, so I started with FIFA. It's always been very close to my heart. I played that since the first iteration to this day, as I'm an avid football fan as well. So we kicked off these teams, which are called basically atomic teams. And the core team was assembled. There was one commercial person, there was a brand person, and there was a developer. Very different, coming from very different worlds. So we basically have to get together and have to build out these strategic franchises in general for these titles. And when you're across so many studios, you meet all kinds of different obstacles and issues. Some people are more willing to work with you than others, and it's very different across all these titles, I would say. But it was a great experience. I believe EA shared recently about Battlefield and what Battlefield will be about. And that is why we worked very hard, because there was a lot of new people who were coming into DICE at that point and into EA in general from other companies, and which were unfamiliar with what Battlefield was, etc. So it was a lot of work getting to the point where we could start to build again in terms of what Battlefield would be in the future. But if I was to pick one thing in terms of the future, it would probably be FIFA. And in football games in general, I believe that you need to have an engagement tool which is different from monetization, and I think it's there. I think there is an opportunity to aggregate the different experiences in football across different media. Football fans are across different platforms. You're seeking your fans' views from YouTube. You're seeking the news from Sky or through multiple news outlets, transfer news through Twitter. It's all different media and channels. And I think there's an opportunity to aggregate them, to get them into one place. And then you create intertwined experiences. I think also that you could engage players much better in terms of they could be building their own player. They could then put that player out on the transfer market and playing that player and getting that player stronger in different positions with different skills secures the engagement, I believe, which leads me to the next thing, because you think about where you build that and there's the next FC coming out. What do you do then? It's very important FIFA or FC becomes a seamless experience that is not bringing out a new experience every year, but it's basically building out an experience that improves every day, every week, every month, every year. So think about it, for example, if it was a subscription model with a free-to-play element, why wouldn't you be able to build a massive following versus the model today, which is about you build this, you launch this product, which takes a lot of effort from the studio and basically vested effort, in my view, because there's so much energy being spent on bringing this to market every single year. But if the effort was to improve the quality of all the modes in the game on a constant basis, where you didn't need to think about how to reacquire players into the experience. It was more about, we just built them. We built up this massive user base over time, partially which is monetized through subscriptions or live service, but the other one also bringing in younger players who might be playing free to play on their mobiles or any device of their choice, which you could then bring into the model later on. The overarching goal there is to build the best possible footballing experiences and improve that all the time and take out all the wasted energy along the way.
We talked about this the other day, actually, in one of our catch-ups. And I remember the time Gareth Bale went to Real Madrid and there was all this like frantic action about what we're going to do about the change in packaging. He's now in a different strip on the front of the cover. And that was just chaos. And you look at it and go, from a player's perspective, by bringing out a new game every year at the start of the season, are they getting anything really fresh, new, innovative? In a lot of cases, they're not, because ultimately it's like a patch on the existing game anyways. It's just a build on top of that. But if you were to look at it in a different light, and rather than say, we're going to spend an absolute fortune on the marketing of a title for Q3 for it to come out then, you would then evolve that time and interest and value and money into research and development. So this live game was there, but continually being added to for the benefit of the players. And the players are also part of that process, because through that wider data, they're able to narrate ultimately what they want and what they don't want. And you can change and evolve it that way. The whole premise of experience, a lot of people are looking at it now. We need to widen our lens a little bit and look and go, what does entertainment look like? How could we potentially cross-pollinate across different avenues? We see this with some of my favorite things at the moment. The Last of Us, for example, or Arcane in the cross-pollination of what was a game into now series on like Hulu and Netflix are doing tremendously well. Not only does this help grow the franchise, but equally it helps grow the community. And I think there is huge value in constant community engagement, because again, you can focus in a little bit more about the experience, about what it is that players enjoy, what they don't, and continue to build. I think sadly, I feel anyways in the industry is that there's always that pushback, I would say, versus long-term versus short-term thinking. Some of the stuff that we've talked about here, you'd almost have to take maybe 2 quarters of a dip in revenue in order to allow, say, a subscription model to be fully brought in, because it would have to take time. But then ultimately, in the longer term, you are growing a franchise that really is growing for the benefit of the player. And also the caveat to that is when you create better quality products and services, naturally your revenue increases as well. So I guess the lens at the moment to me, especially what I've seen today in respect to the various different mergers and acquisitions within the industry, the layoffs that we're seeing, a lot of that focus is on that target of the commercial pie, this proportional share that we have, and how much revenue we could gross if we draw in some of these acquisitions and we let go of those people, rather than what I think would be of benefit if we widen the lens and looked at the landscape and thought, well, where do we want to operate? How do we want to operate? And what experiences do we want to deliver to the players to make sure that they are ultimately engaged in the quality of the content that we're providing? Back to that thing about media, like music, like when we listen to good music's intergenerational, and I still feel the same about games. When you create real quality content, it lasts. Sadly, a lot of games, especially the ones that have been critiqued over negatively, it's because sometimes they're rushed out there and they've got a few bugs in and they don't have that quality. And with titles like FIFA, Battlefield, there is appetite there to create a lasting legacy, but ultimately we need to start building a little bit more for the players now than we see today.
Yeah, the last 18 months have been absolutely brutal in the gaming industry, as we know. And you wonder, why is this? And I think the main culprit of this is COVID, because in COVID, there was a massive increase in terms of demand. Players were playing they were spending an incredible amount of hours and money on gaming. As gaming is fairly inexpensive type of entertainment, you get a lot out of the average game. It could be hundreds of hours for $5 or $10 or $20. You can get that out of a game. So what happened there is that all the forecasting was basically built on the COVID years because you had to show growth. And I think it's just the industry got a little bit sidetracked because of that. And what's happening now, it's because it's a red ocean territory. Is the industry needs to show some savings, right? So they have to have OPEX. OPEX meant the decreased headcount because they couldn't meet their revenue growth targets. And where do all these people go? They create their own studios, all these smaller companies creating amazing content. So you get all this quality content into the gaming space, and all of a sudden there is like a oversupply in the market. And therefore you see that the AAAs or the more expensive experiences in terms of development cost, they're not selling. I think the latest example was the Star Wars game that Ubisoft just launched, which is crazy. Great IP, the game was good, but not selling. And we can see that also across the indie space, etc. The same thing is happening. Gamers are not spending less time playing games. They're spending more time. They're not spending less. There's very little shift in terms of the spend itself. It's just more developers selling content now than before. So where do we go now as an industry? So it would be great to discuss that a little bit. But I think that it's a real issue right now for everyone. How do we basically get out of this situation?
For me personally, I'm looking at the industry, and from a demographic perspective, as you say, like players, they're playing more, but also we've got a broader audience than we've ever had before. I think we're not really serving that audience. Speaking from my player's perspective, I want more deep immersive storytelling, experiences that really move me in the way that when you watch a really good film, you have that experience that moves, that has some form of emotional connection. The FIFAs of the world are amazing, but they need to be elevated to draw in that level of emotion rather than just that level of engagement. And we've got a lot of different areas and avenues to explore. But I know when I want to play a game and sit down and commit my time, I want a game that I can really get my teeth into, that challenges me. This is why I personally see the positives in AI in respect to looking at one of the games that I loved back in the day was Medal of Honor. It's an old game, but the start of that game has always sat with me. You're on one of those boats going on to storm the beach of Normandy, and that experience from a gaming perspective at that time was just unreal. If you apply the lens of AI to that, in the way that swarm intelligence, and akin to some of the discussions we've had previously with Louis Rosenberg on this podcast, if you apply the lens of swarm intelligence, whereby it's not just generative AI from a experience that you look around and go, the weather changes according to how the player's playing and everybody gets a unique experience in that way, that's good. Or it's not just what people are looking at the moment in respect to NPCs, non-playable characters, that you can start interacting with them a little bit more. It's the fact that the AI could learn your playing habits, and ultimately with that, when you pick up and play a game, it's uniquely positioned to you and it's challenging based on your skill level at that point in time. And if, say, you on that particular case, you land on the beach and then you go left, they know you're going to go left. And then all of a sudden you have to rethink what your strategy is going to be. I think that's where the real layer of experience comes in to a deeper level, whereby you've got AI that evolves with the way that you play. So it's a little bit more of a rich and compelling experience and challenging as well, because you don't want anything that's super easy. That's one example. And also you look at the cross-pollination of content. I don't think that games should be solely within the realm of gaming. Half-Life, if that transitioned to a series base or a movie or whatever, or even if you go to studios within EA like BioWare, they created some insane things from the depth of story and narrative. But you also need at that layer leadership to be brave and bold, to be willing to sit with you through this journey. Because when Riot brought out Arcane, it wasn't easy. It wasn't an easy process. It was hard. But ultimately, the rewards are coming now in the fact that it's one of the most watched things on Netflix, and it's building out a real engaged community. And that's the possibilities. But again, you have to look more towards the longer path rather than the shortcut. My biggest fear for the industry at the moment is stagnation. There is amazing people, but ultimately there is also the threat of stagnation, that the industry is just not really innovating in the way it should.
So in general, games started from a premise, right? That this will be the most powerful platform for storytelling. If you think about the possibilities of films today, its potential will become much more powerful than any film or TV series. Why is that? If you look at some of the AI models which you refer to, we haven't really seen AI as applied in a way where you've probably seen the deepfakes and all of that, and scripts and stories, etc. But you haven't really seen it applied where you go deep into a story tree and the content is being written and there's a dialogue that is being written on the go, to your point, based on something else that is happening in the world or has recently happened. So the potential is incredulous. You could go so deep, you could be so immersed, because it's funny that you mentioned BioWare. I have never been as moved in a game like Mass Effect.
Yeah.
They always put you in a completely impossible situation. Do you address a danger that is endangering, let's say, a base? Or do you save your best friend? That's a deep question for you, for a player which is playing a game, that I just started with the controller for about 10, 15 minutes, just wondering about these choices. Now think if you amplify that into a living, breathing world, which is populated by millions of players, creating stories every second, every minute, every hour. I guess that's where you're coming from, right?
Definitely. And also back to what I said about the cross-pollination, to link in with BioWare, one of the best games I've ever played, one of my favorites of all time, is Knights of the Old Republic. Now, honestly, if that became a movie, I'd be sat outside the movie theater wanting to see that desperately. Very rarely do I want to go and watch something at the theater these days. So also from a quality perspective, it builds out not just franchise for the gaming company, but equally LucasArts as well. It allows possibility for partnerships and growth in that dynamic. But also, we have to have focus. We have to make choices, and leadership have to make choices in respect to the avenues they want to follow. It's not just saying, oh, let's go down blockchain and then pause. Let's go down NFTs and then pause. Oh, there's revenue to be made in game skins, then pause. We have to basically say, no, this is the area that we want to play in, and this is ultimately how we're going to build that landscape out. That's what I think is lacking at this moment in time, because, again, people are still caught up within the cycles of games. Q3 is often one of the biggest revenue drivers for an industry. Therefore, the focus is always on Q3 and the build up to then. Rather than just looking at quarters, let's start looking at the next 5-10 years and then working our way back and think this is ultimately how we're going to develop as a company.
I think it was Richard Branson who went public with Virgin at some point, right? And then he was very unhappy with decisions that we made in the company. And he bought it back and he put it into basically owned it privately. And I do wonder sometimes in terms of all these gaming publishers and studios, etc., would we make different decisions if it was not on the stock market? I think the answer is yes. Because all of a sudden, when you're in that situation, you're looking at sustainable growth, which means that you're able to deliver a certain amount or very healthy, balanced profits. And I think that is the key word here, which is balance. How do you enable all these things we talked about? How do you enable the studios, developers, and creators to make the best possible games without putting them under undue pressure of the revenue needs to be brought in? How do you maintain a healthy culture, personnel, etc.? And I think sometimes we've gone too far in terms of demands of these companies, because they suffer when they don't meet a quarter or couple of quarters, because you don't look at the long term or even medium term.
And also, we've got the challenge as well. Hypothetically, if I tied a leadership target to a certain percentage growth and me sat on a leadership board, didn't hit that number, therefore I don't get my bonus, 9 times out of 10, they don't reflect on their own guidance at that period of time. They reflect and go, oh, well, maybe we've got too many headcount and we'll reduce headcount. In any company, it doesn't matter which industry you work in, you need to pipeline talent. And sadly, the thing that often happens within the games industry is there's a pipeline of amazing talent and content that's about to come through, and then they miss a quarter and then things get shelved. Amazing talent will move out. And it's sad because ultimately we do get to see that level of quality in time, because as always happens within the industry, it ebbs and flows. So in the period of downturn, I would argue we're in at this moment in time where it's this reflection, what as an industry we want to be. That talent that's maybe left one of the bigger companies will in time go and set up the type of game and create the type of narrative that they wanted to create. But it just takes time to come to the industry, takes time to come to the player. Whilst if we're really player focused, we would be a little bit more focused on the longer term goals and the project that we're trying to develop. And again, if we really wanted to tie targets to that, we would tie it to the longer term projects rather than short term quarterly aims. That's my view. I think as investors, boards and leadership, we need to be a little bit more focused upon how do we elevate what is an industry that could exponentially grow if we opted to place the time and effort into that growth right now.
Yeah, and these are polar opposites. If you have compensation on one end and creativity on the other end, or rename the conversation to business, like commercial versus creative, it's polar opposites. And if you have creators, they just want to create. And the responsibility of these publishers and the company, they need to create the environment for these creators to be in their element. How do you basically create the optimal situation for them to blossom in? And I think in many cases they're put under undue pressure because of the commercial side or the money side of things. I'm not saying that doesn't have to be a balance, but you need these creators to create these fantastic, fun experiences. And to your point, I think it has gotten a little bit lost. And the people that are suffering are suffering. In the end, it's just a business. And I think sometimes when you've been working in the gaming industry for this many years, it's like a magic show, right? It looks amazing. It is fantastic. You have stars in your eyes. And then when you have seen what goes into the sausage factory, what happens in the sausage factory, how does the magician do his tricks? You've basically seen what happens. So it's not as magical as before. Doesn't change the fact it is still an amazing industry with some of the most phenomenal people I've met at any time. And man, I think it just has lost its way a little bit in the last 2 years. And I really hope it's going to rediscover its softer side, should I say.
Back to that empathy piece and the fun element that you mentioned at the beginning. What got you playing was the fun aspect. What got you continued within your career is the fun of gaming, the amazing industry that it really is, a hotbed of talent. But equally, when we're looking at a development piece, there are aspects like if you look at EA, they've got some cash cows there in regards to continued revenue drivers, but there's also an opportunity to carve away a percentage share of that annual revenue and place it into R&D in the quality of that particular title. And also having some of these sandbox environments whereby we allow creative, talented people to go and just play, figure out a title, a story, a narrative that could add to the wider portfolio of titles a company is bringing out. And only by doing that do you get things like A Way Out or It Takes Two. You give areas quiet to themselves to create a new narrative, something new, something fresh that the industry hasn't seen. And then all of a sudden that aspect of the surprise, the prestige, that moment.
I'm so happy you mentioned Hazelight and Josef and his fantastic team, which actually created almost like a niche in the business. Takes Two is fantastic and they have a really talented team, but be able to play on the couch with a family member or a friend there is not a lot of experiences where you can actually do that co-op. And he has basically created a niche now, and I really hope we would see more experiences coming into that. I have to say that I have rediscovered, in a way, the magic of gaming through my 9-year-old son, Gabriel. He is an avid Minecraft player. He plays a lot of games, but keeps coming back to Minecraft. It's almost like creating all kinds of adventures within that space. It's just like with the joy and happiness these games make for him. He's discovering that magic every single day. You get smitten by that. And I play a lot with him. And I think there's a lot in that space which is undiscovered. Playing together in smaller groups can be so rewarding for players.
That links nicely as well back into the discussion on the future of gaming, because if you look at things like Minecraft, the ability to create your own narratives within a certain confine, there's no issue for the games company to maintain the IP right of that. But ultimately, what I really like about Minecraft is it gives the freedom to the players to express themselves, express the stories they want to tell, create those connection points. And that, to me, is one of the reasons Minecraft does so well, because it opens up that landscape to the player that historically the keys to the castle has always been within the publishers. And I think that when we are a little bit more free with regards to what we allow players to do and get involved in, like feedback loop. We'll create better experiences. The thing is, if you look at AAA, what was the budget for, say, like FIFA or Battlefield or Apex or Star Wars? What would the budget be for one of those titles to be produced? Because I don't think people realize the true cost of a AAA. If you're spending all this revenue on a AAA, and by the time it gets to a player, they're just not feeling it, like what you said about the Star Wars Ubisoft game that's just recently come out. It's because we're not really opening up the whole build process and experience of what we are building with the players. There needs to be a bit like AI. There needs to be that connection between AI and the players to create better experience. There needs to be more of a close connection and partnership between the players and the studios to allow for the creation of games that people really want to play. Because if you get that community build from the very beginning, it's the whole premise of movement thinking. You can galvanize an audience base to go along a journey with you. And when they get to the point of release of that title, then you've got an audience that's hooked and engaged and you've built that trust. But if you are only allowing them to be part of the process come the release of the title, then yeah, like where you're taking your source of information from, you're looking at the trailer. Does the trailer look good? Yeah, maybe it does. But am I willing to spend $65? If you really want gamers to commit their time, then we have to allow them more in depth to the process of the build.
So I think it's a really good point. And I think the company is going to deliver that is Epic. The Unreal Engine is extremely powerful in terms of streaming now through a browser. Will basically enable you to play on any device anywhere in the world, as long as you are connected to the internet, which might be a problem in some countries, but given the distribution of Starlink, etc., that is being resolved. But I think that is the ultimate goal. Instead of being on multiple gaming engines, multiple platforms, all of that, you are in one space. So think about it as Ready Player One without the VR glasses, so to speak. Because one of the problems that the industry has at the moment is discoverability. Yeah. It's very difficult to understand what is your next gaming experience. And if you are in a setup like that, you would see where people are going, where your friends are, etc. You're all in the same world. You're not being split into separate groups on different platforms. There's definitely a future in that. And I think that the way that the Unreal Engine works in terms of development, etc., it's not difficult to learn. And it will lower the barrier to entry. It has already done that. Even now, they're giving more of the revenue back to developers, which is going to accelerate the movement to that engine, I'm sure. You talk about future of gaming. I don't know about you. I know what has been my most memorable gaming experience without the games per se, but just the look and the feel and the emotional connection has been VR. VR has been the niche segment at this moment in time. And it has its problems in terms of motion sickness and all of these things. But you are so immersed in that space that if you have almost lifelike graphics and can move around the space, however you do that, then you can't really get closer to be in the game. It's in the gaming experience itself. I'm not saying go out and build, develop or buy VR. I'm just saying that is the most connected I've had to a gaming experience. So the question is, how do we develop that? And I think we're far away from that. I think even some of these things might be connected to your neural system in the future. But I think it's definitely about how you tie the experience and immersion to what you actually feel without the screens in front of you or glasses or helmets or whatever you might have.
Definitely. I remember going in and playing one of the Star Wars games in one of EA Studios on VR. I think it might have been Star Wars Squadrons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did like motion sickness off that. And I was like, oh man, but still from an experience perspective, the immersion was amazing. And the thing that I immediately go to is thinking of other possibilities. Obviously, they acquired Codemaster not too long ago, so a WRC game would be absolutely phenomenal. But then equally, you've also got opportunities to draw that into other areas. Like I was a big Brian Lara cricket fan back in the day. If you apply that with VR, again, to something that is a little bit more engaging, not only do you improve your technique playing those games, you play for longer. It's just more of a unique experience. Sadly, people just start often within the games industry. They start an idea and think, oh, this is where the next big thing is. And then they go down that route. And then after spending so much time and effort and drawing a lot of talent towards that particular venture, it gets shelved. You just think, what was the point of that? So I think they need to stay the course on some of these things to work out what's good, what's bad, but equally understand that with a bit of clarity and focus, and this is something we believe long-term could add an awful lot, not just the industry, but that wider premise of entertainment and experience.
Definitely.
I could talk to you all day. I love our conversations. We catch up quite frequently, so it's an absolute pleasure. But I'd like to close out with, what would your key thoughts and takeaways be?
Like I said, I think the gaming industry is going to course correct itself. It might take a few years to do that, but I think we will. I think the most important thing, because there's a lot of people out there which have been in a situation of not working in the gaming industry at the moment. I think it would be a shame for the industry to lose that talent and that talent moving on to something else. Because I think this is a temporary thing in terms of the industry. It is a fantastic industry to work in. Some of the most fun, creative people I've ever worked with are in the industry. But it's a young industry. It's going to develop, as you said. So I think that whatever the future might be, VR, AR, or just the ability to play your favorite experiences on any device, I still think, as you said in the beginning, we haven't really touched the surface on what can be created, how you can go much deeper in terms of emotional connections and how you can have more fun, how you can tell deeper stories, how you can implement and apply AI in a meaningful way into games, not just to generate some content, but to generate conversations, go deep, have these stories written, have things, events in game being written. So when you're experiencing that in the game, I'm experiencing something completely different from you. It is always something new, always something being created. I think there's a lot of growth potential in this industry. So I think the takeaway is that wherever you might be in terms of the industry, I am sure it will correct itself, and this will be one of the most fast-growing entertainment industry going forward, which has the most unique ability to tell meaningful stories, as mankind has done since we came about. We have been all about telling stories and playing games, and that will continue.
There's one thing I wanted to ask just before we close out, and that was your view on consoles. It was always a big discussion point during my time at EA, and probably when you were there as well, as to when will be the last iteration of consoles. Do you think there'll be a continued iteration of them, a continued need and desire, or do you think we're just ultimately going to evolve into a new way of playing? Because I know there's always been that desire for continued growth on mobile, and with mobile, every new iteration of mobile, you get heightened level of tech. It also opens you up to a huge user base. But equally, I'm still a fan of consoles. I still love an Xbox experience. At the moment, we're up to Series S or whatever it's called. I've always liked consoles and PCs, but yeah, I'd love to get your take as where that evolves to.
I think we need to go back and think about why consoles. Why do we have consoles? When PlayStation 1 came out and when the first Xbox came out and Dreamcast, it was really complicated to game on a PC. It wasn't plug and play. The console premise was you turn it on, plug in your controller, off you go. I would argue that today that is not necessarily the case. It's become much more complicated, different versions of consoles, not just constantly updating your gaming experiences, right? It's really challenging. So I think that it's not the same premise as it was before. And then now you have the business models, which is very different between Sony and Xbox, all about Game Pass, and Sony is more about the transaction, right? What I really like about Xbox is that they've now expanded their Game Pass experience into smart TVs and other areas, which is great, where you don't need a console. And then we have mobile, especially in terms of Apple. But Apple, same premise, is plug and play, it works. Amazing technology company. As you said, in terms of the mobiles, how much technology are able to fit into smartphones now? And people are not using 20% of the capability that you have at the moment. So if the question is then, why console? Consoleless, PC, whatever. I think it will be none of it. I think it will be about whatever device you have, however you want to experience games. It will be done through streaming in the future. You will have the best possible experience coming out of that based on your device, of what device you choose. And I think consoles will die completely, because you don't need to fulfill that promise anymore that is plug and play, because the plug and play will be available to you on any other device with the same experience. So that's my view. It will bring in more people, broader audiences into this world. And then you will have access to the complete gaming library, and you can play it on any device. As you said before, Knights of the Old Republic is being remastered now by Embracer, but great experience. Maybe you want to go back to the original, but it's very difficult to play that now on any device. You might be able to play it on an older console or something. We also have to protect all the heritage and all these great gaming experiences. And you can't do that just by upgrading all the time when the next console comes out, that the whole gaming library needs to be upgraded again. Therefore, I think that there has to be like an omni platform. Think about if all the Sony exclusives were available for you to play, same with Xbox, etc. I think it's a benefit for the players. It is a benefit for them as companies as well, if players would be able to experience these fantastic games.
The way that I'm looking at it now, obviously, I've always been intrigued by Netflix, especially when they started going with the likes of Mike Verdu and Leon Loeb. They started historically with legacy titles, so you can play the old GTA on there, which is good. But yeah, I agree in time. That's an interesting thing to keep note of. And I think also when we look more up the chain and we look at the streaming wars, we look at things like Amazon, Disney, Netflix, then yeah, as they want to grow their platforms, it would just make sense for Disney or Amazon to be buying EA or to be buying Ubisoft and all their legacy titles. And then again, the experience comes via a $7.99 a month Prime membership. That's interesting. But again, we'll have to see how it plays out. From an acquisition point, if games want to grow as an industry, it comes down to the content that we create. The opportunities to grow aren't just within the confines of console.
And I think it's a great example in terms of streaming. And usually it's the music industry that leads. Yeah. And you will see what's happening now, Spotify and Apple. They're not competing for content anymore. They might have tweaked a little bit how they surface that content, but in the end, it's not very competitive in terms of music anymore. You basically pick your platform and all the content is available on the platform, or the majority of the content. But think about, usually then the TV and the movie industry follow suit. And then the gaming industry, that's usually how it works. If you look at the streaming industry at the moment, it is absolute madness. It's more expensive for consumers to pay for all these channels. And they have split it into so many different platforms that it's almost impossible for you to discover the next movie or the TV series that you're going to watch. So I think there's definitely something there that needs to happen, that you need to aggregate that content, that you need to be able to have access to that content, whatever channel you're on. So the business model needs to be rewritten there. And I think it's the same in terms of gaming. It's interesting you say that, because streaming is definitely a similar place like games, but the music industry has largely solved for that.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. It's been awesome.
It's always a pleasure.